30 years ago, I stood in front of a comic shop advertising the death of Superman in its window display. That moment outside Heroes World set me on a path, a lifelong fan journey leading directly from that tattered red cape to this podcast. Now, together, we mine Superman's vast 85-year mythology by examining, discovering, and reconsidering the stories that have shaped the last son of Krypton. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superman fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the anthology miniseries Superman, Red and Blue is returning guest, Superman cosplayer, Daniel Sanchez. Welcome back.
Thank you. And also, I'm not only a Superman cosplayer, but now you and I are Daily Planet contributor buddies. So we have that going for us, which is nice.
Yes, and it's been great to see your bylines at dailyplanetdc.com, and I encourage everyone to check out the site generally and your articles in particular. And there's at least one story in this anthology that I think probably jumped out at you, and we'll talk about it. But if I look a little puffy or anything like that, I'm not going to lie. I did my reading right before we sat down to record. I was a little delinquent in my homework. And there were some tears as I was reading some of these stories. I found this miniseries to be, I know you didn't know where I was going with that, but I found it to be so emotionally resonant. And there were a number of stories, and you and the audience can probably guess which ones in particular spoke to me based on everything I've talked about on this podcast. But man, there were some that were just so moving. And I'm not ashamed to admit, I was sitting there and tears coming down my face. So I'm coming into this episode, I don't want to say raw with emotion, but I was very moved reading this.
Let me tell you that I did on even my fourth reading, because I have them. I've had them since they came out. These are not my only copies. I have variant cover versions as well. But when this series first came out, I had the puffy eyes. And I think you and I share probably, and we'll get into it, I think we'll agree on which ones reach deep into us. But they're just that good. And it's a testament to what they are that they still invoke that. So I cannot wait to dig into these with you.
Yeah, just to kind of lay this out for the audience, in case anyone's unfamiliar, this is relatively recent, so it's possible that, maybe people missed the boat on this. I did initially, and thankfully now I've remedied that. But this was a 6-issue miniseries published by DC in 2021, 6 40-page issues, each comprised of 5 8-page stories, essentially, by a host of creative teams. And the hook, kind of leaning into the title of Red and Blue, is that it's only colored in red and blue, and there's some black and white stories and things like that. But again, they're just these really beautiful, soulful, slice of life stories that I think are just different than what you typically get in the regular Superman books. And not to knock that, but this was really a very different flavor and had a different objective. And like I said, I really kind of missed the boat when this was originally published. I guess I had very recently started this podcast, but I was still, it's taken me a little while to kind of like get back into the swing. Like now I track what's coming out a lot more closely. Even if I'm not reading it as it's coming out, it's kind of on the list covered down the line. This was still early enough where it wasn't totally on my radar. And I have to give a shout out to Sean Hendricks from Fat Moose Comics. They're one of our sponsors, and he's a great buddy. And he sent me all 6 issues. This is probably a couple of years ago now at this point. And I was so grateful to get them. And I looked at them like, I can't wait to read these. And I sad to say I didn't crack them open until now. And I regret not reading them sooner. But I'm so glad that I finally did, and that I have you here to talk about it with. So now for you, I take it was a different experience. You were reading these. You said this was your 4th time through.
That's probably right. But yeah, I read them when they first came out. And there were multiple times. So it's a 6-issue series, and each issue has roughly 5 stories in it. And beyond the formatting of they're told in limited color, each creative team gets 8 pages, and that is the structure. And as a writer myself, I was really fascinated to see like what people can do with that forced structure, because it brings creativity out of you when you have a forced structure. Mozart did his work in the classical structure, which was the most confining of all the musical periods, and we got Mozart. So that was what drew me in. That was the hook of, oh, I want to see what these writers can do with that. But wow, what they did with 8 pages sometimes. Out of the 6 issues, easily 4 of them, there were times where I said, I got to set this book aside and just think about what just happened and what I just felt, and what I'm going to be thinking about probably for days. I can't go to the next story. I have to set it down. And I had that experience when you first asked me to join on this episode about a month ago, and I just burned through all 6. And I thought, I'm not going to make any notes. I'm just going to read. And the same thing happened. I got to certain ones and I'm like, I know this, I know which one this is. It's like when you're about to watch It's a Wonderful Life. Like, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to read this one. And at the end, like, oh, it got me. It got me again. And so not until yesterday and today did I read through to make my notes. But it is a collection of vignette stories, which gives the authors and artists, and sometimes they're the same. Like Matt Wagner did one, and we'll get to that. But it gives them this opportunity to tell these small pocket stories that might not have been accepted in part of a 22-page regular continuity storyline with its editorial goals, etc. But here's this opportunity to go back to this moment on the Kent farm, or to hear the thoughts of a little boy as there's a battle going on in Metropolis. And these are gold. They're just amazing. So it is never a burden to have somebody want to uh, say, hey, you want to crack those open? So thank you for thinking of me. I'm so glad that this worked out, because I could not be happier to talk about these, especially since you're new. We're going to have such fun.
Yeah, no, I thought you would be such a perfect fit for this, and I'm so glad that you were keen to do it. And no, I echo everything you said. Yes, I regret that I procrastinated the homework so much that I wasn't able to sit with these issues for as long as I would have wanted to. Not that I rocketed through them. I
Yeah.
did take my time, but I definitely came to the end of this reading experience knowing that this is something I will go back to. I think this was
You will.
one of those stories that will sort of always be in the rotation for me. I might not read every story from every issue, but there are ones in particular that I know I'll always go back to. And yeah, the 8 page format lends itself. It's just a different rhythm, and the book itself just has a different mandate, right? So, like we were saying, this isn't about constructing a 6 issue long narrative that furthers the Superman mythology or ties into an event or anything like that. These are really, really some beautiful vignettes, like you said, that get at the heart of the character. And it's one of those things where, if you had told me, oh, you'll be so moved by a story about a waitress who works at the diner in Smallville, who is there serving the Kent family, across generations, I would have said, oh, okay, like that sounds kind of interesting. And you read it, and it's just immensely moving. So, those are the kinds of stories that you get. And I mean, my sense, I believe this was well received at the time. I know they put out a hardcover. I've seen it on shelves, so it's out there and everything. But if anyone's listening to this and you kind of missed the boat on it, or you wrote it off because maybe it's not, it has no bearing on the ongoing continuity or anything like that, please go back, because it's well worth the read, and I think it'll make you feel something.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. And I remember when Batman Black and White came out, what, a decade ago, and I jumped into that for the same reason. And every now and then there were some that may not have been your cup of tea, but then every now and then there were some where, again, those constraints just brought out this other, you know, vein of gold in the in the search for gold. But one of the things that came out to me both times is these short stories will introduce to you creative teams that you may not have encountered before. You may realize, this story I just read, who the heck wrote that? Who is this writer? And it will lead you on this path. It's this introduction to talent that you're well worth um, exposing yourself to this. If nothing else, just because if you love the genre and you love talent, you should do this.
No, that's a great point. It's a great way for readers to meet new creators, and also for the creators to have an opportunity to tell a Superman story where some of them might not have an opportunity otherwise. There's only so much real estate. I mean, thankfully now, as we've been talking about on the podcast, we're in a better space as Superman fans. We have multiple Superman titles. We have Steel and Superboy miniseries. The line is finally expanding for the first time in a while. But for a good long stretch, you really just had a couple of books, and not everyone's going to get a bite at the apple. And so to have an opportunity, even if it's only 8 pages, you bring in different voices, different takes on the character. I mean, uh, reading some of these stories, one of the ones that really comes to mind is the one with Charlie, the man in Metropolis who's been saved by Superman so many times, and they've actually struck up a friendship, and they've had conversations after battles, and they've attempted having lunch a few times. And he goes on Cat Grant's show to talk about all of this, and as he's recounting it, we see it unfolding, and you see Superman in the black suit that he wore after he returned from the dead. You see him as Electric Red Superman, and I'm reading it. I'm like, this is clearly this is someone involved with this, has a lot of affinity for the period of time where I grew up as a reader, and so you see things like that, and you see what the creators are bringing to it, what they've drawn inspiration from, and it's a beautiful thing. Now, I'm pretty flexible as far as how we structure this conversation. I don't necessarily feel we need to be confined to going issue by issue, though I'm certainly happy to do that if you prefer. I think my instinct was to, as a starting point, what were the, let's say, 2 or 3 stories that, and we'll talk about more than those, but like what were the 2 or 3 that really spoke to you the most? I think I can guess, but I want to toss it to you.
Oh boy. Okay, so I made my notes issue by issue just in case that's the way you wanted to go. But yes, there were some standouts. Um, I gotta say that one of them was the crypto story
Yep, that was on my list for you. All right, one for one.
because in that story, it's Clark at a young age on the farm, where I think as little boys, we all kind of remember that period where you're just starting to keep to yourself. You're just starting to be a little quiet. And there's a great scene where Jonathan and Martha are in the dishes and they've learned to whisper because Clark can hear them. And Jonathan's talking about how he's a little concerned about young Clark. And Martha just says, "Leave him be." And then there's another scene later where Jonathan expresses another concern, and Martha just says, "Leave him be." And beyond the fact that crypto is in the story, I am such a sucker for Ma and Pa Kent tales, and those moments where you see their worldview. And it's a cliche to say, well, Superman has these Midwestern values, but it's moments like that. It's moments where Martha's quiet, confident love, where she's just, and that quaint Midwest colloquialism of, you only say as many words as are necessary. And just to have Ma doing dishes and she just says, "Leave him be." Oh my God. I never wanted to leave that world. And the illustrations were fantastic, but that was one that was like just this warm blanket. And I would have stayed there for as many stories of that as there could be. Um, Another one, same vein, and I'm not shy to admit it, was Clark's first day of kindergarten,
Yes.
which was a separate story, lest the audience think that they're the same. But in that story, Clark's not too worried about going to kindergarten. It's Jonathan and Martha that are kind of wondering, have we taught him enough? Have we prepared him enough? And they have to decide, we have done what we can. And Clark's a little nervous about making friends. And so Jonathan says, well, if you tell him jokes, you can win him over. And Clark believes it and says, okay, I'm going to try it. And it's so sweet because he goes to the kindergarten class and he's reminding himself how to behave. And he tells himself, like, don't start floating up and don't run too fast. And Don't let your eyes get all red and angry and you think he's a 5-year-old boy. And in fact, there's a moment where Martha is thinking to herself, he's only 5. And Jonathan is thinking, he's already 5. And again, it shows that wonderful dynamic, this small farm dynamic of how they think, about Clark. But the reason I love this story is he does well. He makes friends and he's so happy about it. And then gradually he notices that there's a little girl there who isn't making friends and isn't doing so well. And so he goes home and he talks to Jonathan and Martha about it. And they give him this wonderful advice where they say, Clark, it's not enough to see a problem and be bothered by it. If you see a situation that is a problem, especially if it affects or hurts another person, you have to think of yourself as the solution to that problem. And then they just let him think about that. They sort of kissed him goodnight and they let him have his own thoughts, which again, as far as small town parenting, is amazing. And so you see the next day he goes to school and he doesn't know how he's going to accomplish this, but he knows he wants to help this girl. And he realizes in his inner monologue that those jokes that he tells were not his own. He didn't invent them. Pa told him that. And some of the other advice that he got was from Ma. So he realizes people helped me do well. I want to help her do well. So when you know this, the grown Superman that he becomes, and you read this story of 5-year-old Clark at kindergarten and how he's already taking in these lessons, then he finds a way using a shared love of horses to bond with this girl, and they play with these little plastic horses, and the other kids look over and they say, well, what are they doing? And they like horses too. And that's the door. That's how he brings the little girl into the friendship circle. And he's so happy when he goes home. He's that kid who just can't wait to jump off the bus and tell mom and pa it worked. And then later they have a party and all the kids come, including that girl. And I believe there's a line in there somewhere where he thinks, it's not that mom and pa gave him all the answers, but they taught him the lesson. And there is no limit to the number of times I could read that story or learn something new. And that is one that I set aside and I thought, not because I'm crying, although I probably am a little, but I just want to think about that. And I just want to let that story help me be better.
Yeah, no, well said. I loved hearing you lay out both of those stories, and both of those really resonated with me as well. Especially little Clark going off to kindergarten. Our son just finished his first year of preschool, so we have another year before kindergarten. But even just sending him to that first year of preschool, a lot of those same emotions where you're sending him out, and it's so funny because recently, again, obviously every day we're dropping him off and picking him up, but it's limited in terms of what we're seeing. And around Easter time, they did an Easter egg hunt, and the parents got to go, and so we got to watch him, like really watch him in this environment here and interacting with his classmates and everything. And it was just this weird thing of like they have their own world, like their own little ecosystem and their own dynamics. And as much as we've been watching this kid like a hawk and we know everything he does, but it's like, he's there at school, like he's got his own little world. And even just letting go that little bit, like it took a minute to get used to. And of course we did. And it's been a wonderful routine and great for everybody. But it was definitely like at the outset, it was so daunting, the idea of just like dropping him off and leaving him there. And that's not even taking into account what the Kents had to deal with as far as this little boy with powers. And what I loved, I agree with everything you said about the little girl, that line about it's not enough to be bothered. I think that's one that's going to sit with me for a while, because that stopped me in my tracks too. And I was like, that's a magnificent point and something that all of us, myself included, probably need to keep in mind, right? It's one thing to make note of something that might not be right, but like we say at the end of every podcast, it's about what you do to whatever extent you're able to, in whatever form that takes. And I think it would have been so easy in this story for it to have been Clark being the outsider in the classroom, right? That would have been the easier version of the story, and it would have tracked and it would have been fine. But the fact that, like you said, like he's off and running, he's making the friends, and he sees this other girl. And in some ways, I mean, they're you know, it's certainly difficult if you're the one left out, but it puts him in such a tricky spot because he's achieved socially a lot in this class in a short amount of time, and now he's running the risk of jeopardizing this. And you know, we're talking a little kid. I mean, grown people can't navigate this, let
Hmm.
alone a little boy. And so the courage that it takes to reach out to someone who the rest of the class has kind of discounted and bring them in, and in so doing, set the example for others to follow. And the other kids do follow it. It is wonderful, and you know, thematically ties in with some of these other stories as well, where you see, you know, again, in terms of what how Clark is inspired by other people, how he inspires them, how he's helped by a number of people in these various other stories. It's a beautiful thing. But yeah, those stories definitely stood out to me too.
Yeah, and you know, in being a parent, once you experience that life journey, you read these stories differently. Because I know your Smallville journey, you've talked many times about how you perceive it from different, characters' points of view. But this brought me back to my first child's first day of kindergarten, when, as a parent, you're hoping that, just like Jonathan, that you've prepared them enough. And I vividly remember we were in the car and my little girl looked at me and she said, "What if I don't make friends?" And I said, "You know what? I bet that there is at least one other little girl who feels just like you, and she may even be more scared than you. So let's do this. When you get to school, look around and see if you can find another little girl who looks even more scared than you. And will you go over and make her feel better?" And she goes, "Okay, I think I can do that." I picked her up from school. She got in the car. She had this huge smile. And she said, "Dad, I made so many friends." And this story did a validating thing for me, because by no means do I think that I have the wisdom of Pa Kent, but it made me feel like on that day I sort of summoned some Pa Kent. I said the right thing in the right moment when it mattered, and I got to see that instilled. And you only hope as a parent that you have some of those moments. But when I read the story, like, now she's grown and she's doing fantastically, and it's not often that I think about kindergarten, but I read this story like literally today again, and whoosh did it take me back. um, it was so valuable in that. But like you're saying, and I'm sure that this probably is one of the stories we're about to get to, is you contrast that with Jonathan before he has that confidence. There is a story where Jonathan goes to church because he's not confident and he's questioning his ability to be a parent to this adoptive child. And by the way, I was surprised that in the story it was a Catholic church. For some reason, I always assumed otherwise. They just struck me as Baptist in the movies and in some of the prior books.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I had an actual minister on the show when we covered For Tomorrow, and he gave his assessment of what faith he would imagine the Kents would have followed. And yeah, off the top of my head, I forget exactly which denomination he landed on. But yeah, that was surprising, but you know, certainly worked for what they were pulling out of it.
yeah, but as far as the ones that made me cry, this was the one that made me cry. Um, that when the the priest gave him that advice of, just tell them that you love them, just tell them that you're proud of them, just tell them that they're special. And Jonathan went home, and you see these scenes of, from the time Clark is in a crib before he can understand what it means. Jonathan looks over the crib and says, "You are special." And then Clark grows a little bit more and he does something out on the farm, and Jonathan says, "I'm proud of you." And then Clark grows up a little bit more and he does something, and Jonathan says, "I love you." And it continues throughout Clark's life. And there comes the panel where Clark is standing in front of Jonathan's grave, and still in the mental narration, and I'm probably going to get a little choked up, but still in that mental narration, you hear, "I'm proud of you." And that was one where I had to just stop for a second, because the the impact of that moment means that Clark still feels it from beyond the grave. He still feels his father's love. And what a testament to the way a father has raised a son, that his son still feels it. And then Clark now has to find his own way without Jonathan telling him that every day and hugging him. And what he chooses to do is to turn and give that. And you see him perform a rescue, and he says, "You're special." And then he is with a group of children that he's just saved, and he says, "I'm proud of you." And you see him do that. And in the final panel, he is floating in space looking down at the earth, and it's so beautifully drawn. You feel the way he's just forgetting any other thing except this one thought. And he looks at this big beautiful world, and in this great drawing are just the simple words as he looks at the whole earth: "I love you." Like, what can you even say about that or add to that besides just let it be the gift that it was? um I am so thankful for these for these writers and these artists who have found these little entry points to say something meaningful.
No,
And guys, this isn't
absolutely.
even all the stories.
Yeah, I know that's only a few, but no, that was the one. That was the one that really got me. And that last page that you mentioned, where it's Superman in space looking at the world and saying "I love you." I've seen that floating around social media, and I always was struck by it. And I said, "Oh, that's beautiful," but I didn't know the context. And now I have the context for it, and it hits so much harder. And it calls to mind a couple of things. And I've talked multiple times on this podcast about one of the scenes from the Superman and Lois pilot, where Clark is out on the porch with Jordan, who's struggling with these developing powers, and Clark's talking about his experience with Jonathan and how Jonathan didn't know what he was doing. Right, he tells his son, is like, he was just on his way to church. Going back to the religious aspect, like he was on his way to church one day, and they found me, and it changed his life, and he had to learn how to be a parent instantly. And the message there was that he didn't always have all the answers, but he was there. And that's something that's resonated so much. And seeing, actually now getting to see that incarnation of Jonathan, the one at the outset who doesn't have all of the answers, who's kind of struggling a little bit and looking for some guidance, because we always know and think of Jonathan as the one with the answers, with the speeches, with the
Mhm.
parables, with the lessons that Clark will carry forward. But you see him at the beginning not really knowing. It was interesting. He was a little older than I would have expected. I mean, I guess that harkens back more to the traditional depiction of the Kents, but in the modern era, clearly, we've seen them younger when they take in Clark. But this was a little bit of an older Jonathan, but very relatable and fascinating to see that version of him. And then, exactly as you described, this montage of Jonathan and Clark as Clark is moving forward through the years, and Jonathan just continually saying, "You're special. I love you. I'm proud of you." And I don't want to rehash this, because I talked about this when we covered Space Age and the similar idea of always saying "I
Mhm.
love you" and everything. But it is, from the beginning, kind of just instinctively, I knew that was how I wanted to be, and how I have been and hope to continue to be with my son, where I tell him that every day. And it's that I want that to be, I feel it so deeply that I always want to say it, but it's like beyond that, I want it to be so ingrained in him, right? Just like it was with Clark, so ingrained, such an automatic, that it's never anything he has to stop and wonder about. Oh, is my dad proud of me? No, no, no. You know it, because I tell you every day. Like, I just want that to be just a part of it. And so that, man, it just hits so hard. And then, yeah, when you get to, and that's the thing too with these stories, that's really kind of, keeps you on your toes in a way, because they're not beholden to any ongoing
Mhm.
narrative or continuity. So we could have been reading a story where Jonathan Kent is still alive, as he is currently in the comics, right? But that was not the case. And so as you're reading it, it hits you like a ton of bricks when you see Clark standing at the grave. But then, yeah, to see Clark take those lessons and then kind of pay it forward, right, to all the people that he's
Mhm.
saving. It was just wonderful. That one, yeah, that I mean, that one was definitely my favorite and definitely had the most emotional impact. Just top notch.
Yeah, easily. There's no way to rank them, but easily one of the absolute shining stories in all of these.
Absolutely. And just to jump back to the first one that you mentioned, the crypto story, not to, I know we're focusing on the heart here, but just taking a step back, looking at the larger Superman mythology, as I've talked about many times, the whole Superboy aspect, Clark as Superboy, is something that that's never totally resonated with me, and crypto's kind of goes hand in hand with that. I have nothing against crypto, but a story like this, I think, went a long way towards making me get the appeal of crypto even more, especially at that stage in Clark's journey,
Mhm.
and especially at, like you said, that point in time where he is feeling alienated, and he's coming of age, but he's everyone feels different at that point, and he actually is different, and so, like, in a very fundamental way. And then so to have this connection point, connection to his home world, sharing with this other being, the only other one who knows what it's like to be like him,
Mhm.
is really a powerful thing. So I'll kind of keep that in mind as I delve into Superboy territory in the not too distant future.
I I love the way that some of these stories, and there's a few of them, took something from continuity, from issues that you may have read when you were a child. Some might be from the 50s, some might be from the 90s, but like they even took the Brian Michael Bendis press conference where Superman tells the world he's Clark, and they brought that word for word into one of these stories. So I love the way that some of these will mine that territory. But in this crypto story, um, it it told the same story. Clark was
Right.
at the farm. A rocket crashed. They didn't know what it was. He ran out, and it was this dog. And not only was it a dog, it was his dog, um, because the coordinates had been set by Jarrell as a test. And the thing about this retelling of the story is it does not mess with the myth, but it gives you a little bit of heart. It turns the diamond a bit, and you can see this other facet of how Clark felt about it, because we saw how he was feeling before the ship landed, which was not part of the original story. And there's a scene where Clark goes, "Oh my gosh, it's a puppy," and he takes the puppy out, and thinks it's just a normal puppy. So it's sitting there, and it looks up at Clark, with these big eyes, and then, like a puppy, just takes off running, but it takes off at super speed. And Jonathan and Martha have this look like, "Oh boy." And there's just a trail in the corn. And Jonathan and Martha are trying to look ahead, like, what has this done to our life? And there's a little panel, and it's just an inset, but it shows a detail of Clark's little boy face, and he's got this twinkle in his eye, and he's got this smile, seeing how fast the dog is, and he just goes, "I got him." And then he takes off, and you realize this is a friendship for the ages. This is what Clark needed. This is that companionship. um, and there's been other stories that have ended with, every boy needs a dog,
Right.
but how much more so in Clark's position of loneliness? How how much of that emptiness did this dog fill for him? It brought him back to being whole again. And it shows, Jonathan has to tell him, "Clark, try not to throw the stick all the way to Missouri next time." And Clark's like, "Okay, Pa." And it's cute and it's adorable, but you also really get how Ma and Pa's lessons aside, Ma and Pa are not like Clark. And they could have done a, a job to get Clark, from where he was to maybe here. But that dog who made him feel not alone in the universe, that dog who made him feel all of the connection, that took it further than mom and pa could have. And that's the value of Crypto. That's the love that I have for him. I mean, my dog is Crypto. But he has a place in literary history of Superman, and for me, that's the reason why.
Yeah, no, and I think this has given me even greater appreciation for that. We were never pet people, and I never had a dog, so I think a little bit of that is lost on me. But again, I enjoy the character. Please don't get me wrong here, people. But again, this story, I think, further cemented that. And it's funny you mentioned the Bendis secret identity reveal and how that gets played on here.
Mhm.
It's, I believe, the final story of issue 6, where there's a young boy who is struggling with coming out,
Mhm.
and he watches the Superman press conference and he sees Superman be his truest self, and that inspires him to tell his family that he's gay. And that was a tough one. I love the boy's journey in that story and coming out and being his authentic self as the Superman nerd. I never liked the secret identity reveal. I like its impact here, I suppose. Although one of the things that I didn't like, and as we've talked about, that genie's been put back in the bottle as far as Clark's secret identity, and I'm glad for that, because it never really sat right with me that it felt like. And again, this story kind of plays into that, and I don't want to undermine this story. It's beautiful, but I never liked this idea that the secret identity was kind of equated with, being in the closet with respect to your sexuality or what have you, because I felt like there is a place for the secret identity, and it's different. And I felt like that was kind of getting conflated, whether it was the Bendis story or, the end of the Supergirl TV series or what have you. So I had a little bit of that swimming around, but I liked the way that this played out and the effect that it had on this particular character in this story.
Yeah, I would agree with you because one of the things that is one of my takeaways from all 6 issues and all the stories that are in them is there are particular lines that characters will say and thoughts that they will have that I'll be thinking, I'm enjoying this story. It's okay. I like, and then somebody will say something, and I'll just go, oh, that's what this is about. That's that's the purpose of all of this. And stylistically, it might not have been my favorite compared to a Robert Venditti written story or a Matt Wagner story, but in this one, the writer, by the way, is Rex Ogle. Excuse me, not Max, Rex Ogle. And there was a line in there where the boy is just about to decide to have the courage to come out. And the line says, with those 2 little words, the world is a more honest place, a safer place, not just for me, but for everyone. And I think in the world of this kid, when he saw Superman stand up to that podium and say the truth about himself, the distinction between were Clark's reasons for having a secret identity different, those distinctions were not where that kid was at in his life. Where he was at is he witnessed someone do this honest thing, and that gave him the courage to do an honest thing. And the line, with those 2 little words, the world is a more honest place, I really appreciated that that's where it ended up. And I think that anyone could read this story and equate that however they like in their own life.
Sure.
It could be a work situation, it could be a family situation, it could be, your relationship with your father, it could be a lot of different things. But if the takeaway is you were inspired by someone else's actions to say, I'm going to choose honesty, then what a story to end not just that issue, but the whole series on. Because if Superman stands for certain things, that is definitely one of them.
Yes.
So,
For, I'll say there were a couple of other ones that made me think of you, that I was like, oh, I'm sure Daniel loved these. One was that Matt Wagner story featuring Clark the
mhm.
reporter, and thought it was great. You see him in the Fleischer-esque costume, and sort of set pieces that call to mind the Fleischer cartoons in terms of the adversaries and things like that. But the thrust of it is that Superman is getting all of the headlines, the front page stories, and Clark is writing these in-depth stories about what's kind of behind all of these things, like how did the mad scientist get the materials that he used for his robot. And these stories are getting buried on page 13 of the paper. And you see
Mhm.
Clark struggling with that. And look, anytime we get Clark as the reporter in a meaningful way, I love. And I thought that was it was such a great story to show, because I guess it shows a couple of things. It shows what Clark can do, or at least is trying to do as a reporter. And I think the story even
Mhm.
opens with him saying, I took this job initially to help me further my crusade, right? And I think the
Right.
implication of that is that yes, and that was the jumping off point, but that there is, he sees this opportunity to do more good, or to do good in a different way, by shining a light, by sharing the truth. And again, it keeps getting relegated to the back pages of the paper. And so, again, you see what he's trying to accomplish in a different way, not just as Superman, but also, I think, a very human, very relatable frustration that, it's getting lost in the shuffle. And it's, he's essentially competing with himself here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love the scene where he even goes into Perry White's office to try to argue like the editorial slant of the paper, and to try to get Perry to run more real news and less Superman on the front page. And Perry has to say, look, the Daily Planet, as the editor in chief, I have two responsibilities. One is I have an integrity. I have responsibility to the truth and to the reputation of the journalism of this newspaper. And two, I have to sell papers, Clark, and Superman sells papers. And then, Clark has to accept that because it's coming from a place of truth. I mean, Perry was telling him, he was being completely transparent. This is how the world works, Clark. And, but then he has to see Lois, which, by the way, I love the Phyllis Coates sort of tough as nails version of Lois here, definitely the 40s version. And he's got to see her like basically just being the toast of Metropolis, coming in like, hey, boys, how does it feel to be in a room with me? Hey, and Clark's out on the street listening to these two citizens of Metropolis talking about the latest Superman adventure. And Clark just sort of almost like a kid at school. He just sort of leans over and he goes, well, there's another story about that later on, about how there was a government contract, and the bad guy really shouldn't have been able to do what he did, because this government connection should not have been allowed to happen. And um, the there's a moment where Clark's actually happy because those guys go, "Oh, really? Well, let's check that out." And they flip to that page and they take one look, and the guy goes, "Ah, it's too long to read." Like that's the 1940s version of too long, didn't read. And then the other guy goes, "Yeah, I prefer the funnies anyway," which of course is tongue in cheek to Schuster, and Siegel and Schuster's original goal of all they wanted to do was be syndicated in a newspaper. So ironic that Clark now has to suffer the fact that that's been successful, but just the heartbreak that he has of even when he's nudging people, hey, go look at my story, they're not interested. So beyond the fact that I love Matt Wagner's storytelling style, I have loved him since Grendel. I thought his Batman and Grendel story was some of the best Batman that I've ever read. I love Matt Wagner's storytelling ability and the way he would have the old style newspapers as the backdrop of the narration. So you'd
Yeah.
see the Fleischer's drawn Superman fighting my favorite, the robots with the big number on their chest. But in the background is that cocked newspaper, you know, that just brought you so completely nostalgically back to that era. But style aside, the fact that this story ends with Clark at this low point of he came to do real good. And yes, he may have stopped giant robots from stealing jewelry and diamonds from a store, but he talks to Pete Ross on the phone. And he's sort of trying not to come across as needy to Pete. He's trying to just say, "Hey, let's talk like we used to." And God bless his heart, Pete says, "Well, Clark, I read that story." And Clark goes, "Oh, you did?" Almost, like you did. And Pete just says, "Clark, I read all your stories." And he proves it. He starts talking about, I remember when you wrote about this, when you wrote about that. And it's almost that crypto moment. Like that's the thing that Clark needed to not stay in this low point where he was actually wondering, am I alone here? Am I the only one who's trying to achieve this thing? And that's that's a best friend for you. Like that's the Pete Ross that we know and love.
It was such an unexpected appearance. I didn't, I think we would see Pete in these stories, and certainly not necessarily in that one. And I was so happy, not just that he popped up, but that he served that function. And yeah, I think that was, the wind in Clark's sails that he needed at that moment. And I thought that was a great touch. And there's also another bit where Clark articulates this idea that he doesn't, it doesn't sit right with him to report on himself as
Mm-hmm.
Superman, right? Which I think is a great touch, and again shows his integrity, and also that, because again, right, this comes up so many times. We have plenty of versions of the story where he gets the job at the Daily Planet because he gets the scoop on Superman, and of course raises certain ethical
Oh
questions
yeah.
with respect to journalistic integrity and all of that. And I think one of the things that's so cool about this story is like, it's like there are other things for him to do, right? There are these other stories, other truths that he's trying to bring to light, and then. Sort of the capper to this is he decides to write his own story, but for himself, at least for now. And he's sitting down at the
Mm-hmm.
typewriter, and he's, telling the story that only he can tell, right, about who he really is, and all of that. And I don't know how else I would have ended the story. In fairness, I don't know how satisfying I felt that as the payoff to that specific one, but I think it works well enough in the context. What about you?
I'll tell you that I had a different take on it this week reading it than I did before because I've been fortunate enough to start writing articles for the Daily Planet. So I've been getting into that journalism mindset. And when I reached the end of this story on this latest reading, it hit me. I get it. I get it because Clark has to get out of his own way. And the way he does that is to write the story of the century. And he's going to finish it. He's going to put it in a box. He'll probably put it under the floorboards. But he got it out of his system. He wrote it. And now he's out of his own way. And now he can face tomorrow with a different perspective. And I got it. Like I understood that.
There is, one thing that I do identify, because over the years, whether it's the articles I've written or all of these many podcasts or the documentary films that I've done, sort of my personal philosophy has always been do what you're passionate about, what you enjoy, do whatever it is that is worth doing to you, even if no one else is reading or watching or listening. And I think that served me well, because I think if you get too caught up in the reaction, the results, it can be a fool's errand sometimes, or at a minimum, it can be very frustrating. At the same time, it's definitely very galvanizing when you get that response. But yeah, I do think kind of as that threshold matter, doing it for yourself, putting out into the world, or in this case, even just in a drawer, for Clark, what you want to create. I do think is probably the healthiest, most productive starting point. You feel for Clark in this though, because with news in particular, I feel like it's a little bit of a different angle there, because you're doing it, it's different than writing something creative per se or something like that, where, kind of like just the process of putting it together might be satisfying enough. I guess that's true to an extent if you're writing a hard news story, but it's like ultimately you are doing it. There's a very, I guess, specific, tangible outcome that you're looking to achieve, and so I mean, it's still in the paper, albeit a bit buried. But I guess I felt for Clark in this story.
Yeah. Yeah. And even if you think sometimes you do things just for yourself, the next time Lois comes in and, it's like, how does it feel to look at a superstar, guys? Clark's going to go, you know what? That's okay. You can have your moment now because I know that at, at my house under my floorboards is going to be my moment. So I'm not bothered by this. And I think that helps that to bring that balance back to him and what he does day to day.
We mentioned in this story Pete Ross, and kind of on the note of friendship, there's another story featuring Jimmy Olsen, and written by Josh Williamson, who of course has now
Mhm.
taken over the Superman title. And it's this great story where Jimmy's being interviewed, and he's asked what his favorite Superman picture is, and we see all these different shots that Jimmy's taken over the years, and then one moment in particular where Jimmy's racing to get this shot, and it's Superman kind of kneeling down with two kids that he's just saved after this big battle. And you kind of assume that's going to be the shot. And then, Superman flies up. And I love that he's like, hey, pal. Right? That's how
Yeah.
he greets Jim. And Jim's so excited about this shot. And Superman's like, you had left the, the cap on the camera, the lens cover. And when he, removes it, he takes this shot of the two of them. And that's his favorite shot. And
Hmm.
it was just just like a fun, light Jimmy story, but I really liked it. And I think what I enjoyed most of all was just kind of that easy rapport between the two of them, and like a genuine friendship that I always want to see more of. So I thought that was a really that was a fun one. I like that one.
Yeah, I love that one too. The fact that the point of the story is that this person is asking Jimmy, of all the pictures you've ever taken of Superman, what one is your favorite? You know, and you imagine, there's monumental ones. There's, it's like asking the photographer from Marvels, what was your favorite shot that you ever took? I mean, Jimmy Olsen, oh my gosh. And the fact that ultimately his answer was that it was an accidental selfie
Yeah.
because he had missed the great shot. And by the way, when you see that drawn in that panel, it would have been such a good shot. The depiction of it artistically was amazing. And you look at that and you go, yeah, if I had missed that one, I would have hated myself too. Um, but the fact that when Jimmy accidentally hits the button because he was looking at the camera and like, oh, I did leave the lens cap on, um, that Superman has his hand on Jimmy's shoulder and he's giving him this really friendly smile, like, that's okay. This isn't the world. We're friends. And Jimmy's kind of shrugged it off already because his friend is here. Not that it's his friend Superman is here, it's that his friend is here.
Yep.
And his friend just said, it's okay. And so Jimmy has this expression of, you know what, you're right, it is okay. And Superman has this smile, and that's the shot, that's the selfie. And then when that's depicted and drawn in this issue, you look at that and you go, okay, you're right, that one's better. I mean, that one I can. So you totally believe it, and it is so wonderful. It's just Jimmy and somebody sitting at a table in a cafe, and that's the whole point. That's why I love these vignettes. Is there would not really be the real estate in any other story to do that unless it was a backup feature somehow. Um, but just if you didn't already love Jimmy, you kind of have to start loving him with this one. This would be a good entry point if somebody said, "I've never read anything at all pertaining to Jimmy Olsen." I think I'd be tempted to give him this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just what's so beautiful is that it's the photo that means the most to him, right, is the one that captures the essence of their friendship, the one that
Hmm.
could only have been taken because they're friends, right? Like the shot that he missed, yes, it would have been a gorgeous shot and it would have been on the front page of the paper, but not to diminish Jimmy as a photographer, but anyone else who had been in that spot in that moment could have gotten that. But the one of the two of them laughing, right, was just this genuine moment and a side of Superman that so few get to see, but he has this friendship. Yeah, that was a really fun one. There's also, I guess, while we're talking about Clark the reporter, it's funny. I wasn't even, I wasn't thinking about this so much as I was just kind of taking each story in. But thematically, you can kind of group them in certain categories.
Hmm.
We talked about a number of the smaller ones. There are a couple others as well, of course, and then some of the Metropolis Daily Planet ones. And a really fun one is when Clark is trying to make his deadline at the Daily Planet, as well as arrive to dinner with Bruce and Diana on time, and the two of them have taken bets about whether
Yep.
or not he'll make it. And it's great because Diana says to Bruce, "What does she initially propose? $100?" And he's like, "Make it 10,000, and we'll do it."
Make it 10,000. Yeah. And Clark hears them. Like he's still on the phone with Bruce. He can hear them betting on him.
Yeah. And what's
And
yeah, no, go ahead.
just that they decide that whoever wins, they're going to donate it to charity. So they both do things that they know Clark would like. So I think Bruce says, well, if I win, I'll give it to agriculture development. And Diana said, well, if I win, I'll give it to journalism education. So, I mean, there's no way to lose, but still, Clark's pride is on the line.
Yeah, and I think yes, absolutely. It also, just as a quick side note, it made me think of How I Met Your Mother, one of my all-time favorite shows, because there was this running bit where Barney was this big gambler, and he could never turn down a bet, but he also was into the high stakes. So I know one of the other characters at one point bet him $50. He's like, 50, make it 5,000. And it really it really called to mind that bit. But what I really enjoyed was seeing how well Bruce and Diana know Clark, and how they each know him in different respects, right? Because initially, what is it? Yeah, I think Bruce says something to the effect of, because they're talking about how he is going to change into Superman to make it to the planet in time, as opposed to trying to take an Uber across town.
Right.
But they recognize he's going to be, encountering any number of, calls for distress, calls for help in the midst of all of this, and he'll be interrupted. And Bruce
Right.
talks about, well, once he's done with that, he'll be able to get back to the planet quickly. And Diana's like, well, but he's not like you. He doesn't just like disappear into an alley. He's polite, right? He's going to stop and he's going to talk to people and he's going to take photos and things like that. But then kind of the flip of that, where we see how well Bruce knows Clark, he talks about Clark's integrity and dependability as a journalist, right? And
Mm-hmm.
kind of is talking about Clark's achievements in that field and how he never misses a deadline. And, this is a core attribute of his character. So it was cool to
Mm-hmm.
see, again, within this trinity, how well they know each other, but in different ways.
Yeah, and you wonder like how long has their relationship, existed, that there's such intimate friends in this way. Um, but there's some real insight there of how well they know Clark, because Bruce, I believe, is the one who says, Clark's life as a journalist means so much to him. It's one of the things that he feels makes him human. And you see him reassuring Perry, I won't be late, I won't miss deadline, I won't fail your trust in me. But then Diana says, yes, but that's Clark, but he's also Superman. So he still has to traverse the distance, where he's in the alley, doing the change. Which, by the way, I was reading the story and I thought, oh, this is a pretty good story. This is a pretty good story. Page 2, panel 2, you see him running in the alley, about to do the shirt rip, and the art is just like, it won me over in that moment. I'm like, I went back and I looked, okay, now who's the artist on this? Because you just got me with that panel. Oh, it's Laura Braga. Okay, mental note, look up Laura Braga later. Um, but he still has to traverse the distance of where he is to the Daily Planet. And Diana goes, you really think that he's going to pass by anybody who needs help along his way? And it shows this montage of, no, he will not. He's saving people left and right, and stopping to make sure that they're okay. And even with some kids, like, let's take a picture together, and talking with the firemen, and and you feel the clock, tick, 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 tick. But when he's with those kids, you do not feel that. You do not feel that he has somewhere else to be or somewhere better to be. And that resonated with me in my charity work and in my cosplay work, because the value of that, the value of a child when they're with Superman, feeling like he is present and he is not acting like he has somewhere better to be than to talk to me and spend time with me. Like, that panel made me love Superman again, because Bruce and Diana, who know him intimately, were saying, well, that's who he is. And we got to see that. I even came up with the trick sometimes of, if I really do have somewhere else to be and I really do have to say goodbye to a child, what I'll do is I'll say, I have to go, but I don't want to just shake your hand up. Let's shake it twice, you know, and we'll do a double goodbye. I'm telling you, that extra 5 seconds, that extra, you're not just going to get one, you're going to get two. It makes that goodbye okay. The child accepts, you're Superman, you're busy, but when you were smiling at me, you were my friend, and you didn't leave me because you wanted to. And you really get that here. Um, it's just amazing.
No, I know it's so nice, and it's whether again in the work you do is with your charity organization and as a cosplayer, I think this comes up a lot in the realm of actors and other celebrities and things like that, where you they and you have these interactions with people. It's like for the celebrity, we'll just put it that way. It's another interaction, right? They'll be done with that and go about their day. But for the person that they're having that
Mm-hmm.
interaction with, that could be a memory that they'll carry with them forever, right? And so, yeah, you hope that the person on the other end, who kind of has that power, will use it well and hopefully make it a good experience. Not that people are owed anything, but there is that kind of dynamic, and you get the sense Superman is well aware of that and that power that he has. And there's another, I guess, thematically related story where there's a little girl who comes into school for show and tell, and she's talking about this piece of debris that Superman gave her after this battle, and how she helped him during this, and they're friends, and all the other kids are mocking her, and she's being ostracized, not unlike that kindergarten story that we had talked about earlier. And then Superman takes the time to show up at this little girl's school, and of course everybody comes around, and it's this important lesson about about treating other people well, and everything. And just this great moment, and the fact that Superman would take the time to do something like that just speaks volumes about his character.
Yeah, it's very, the end of Shazam, where he takes the time to go to the cafeteria and sit down next to the kid who everyone was making fun of, and it turns out, no, you really do know Superman, and he really does legitimately like you enough to come here and not think that it's some chore.
For sure. There's another story that, again, made me think of you because, in particular, the art, it very much called to mind the Christopher Reeve incarnation of the characters, the one where Clark, not Superman, but Clark talks down that would-be robber at the convenience store. And, that was tremendous. I know it was not Wilfredo Torres, but the art style kind of felt like in that vein. And I know, of course, you're a big fan, and we've talked about that. But, I thought that was such a great one. And yes, I suppose you can make the argument Clark was able to be so calm and able to do all of this because he knew he would be okay. But you get the sense he would have done it anyway, right? That's the thing. And he was able to get through to this person who clearly was in over his head, right? And had gone down a bad path, but there was a chance to kind of pull him back. And Clark took that chance and was able to set him straight and actually lets him go. At the end of it, with the promise that this guy will never come back here and will not do this again. What was your take on that one?
Oh, I absolutely loved it. It's called De-Escalation, and the artist is Valentin Delandro.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick, and thank you for sharing that that artist. I know we've been talking about a bunch of these stories already, and I know we have not been giving the creative teams every time. There are so many. We really appreciate everyone's work, and again, I do encourage everyone to check this out, and you can see who did each of these stories that we talked about. So if we're not saying a creative team's name, it's not a slight in any way. It's just that there's a lot, and we have a lot to get through.
Well, I didn't know some of these artists myself until I read these. So this is just another reason that everyone has to go pick up these books. But there's a particular panel on page 2 where the way the Clark is drawn is a dead ringer duplication of Christopher Reeve in the alley after he caught the bullet from Lois, and he's sort of turned down and his chin is down, and he's when he opens his hand and sees the bullet, but then he kind of looks out the side of his glasses. There's a drawing that is exactly like that in this story. And it was one of those moments where I was already intrigued by the art, because on page 1, Clark comes into this little like convenience store bodega kind of a place, and he bumps into an old school comic book stand, one of those vertical metal that has the sign that says comics at the top. And he knocks it over and he acts like, oh no. And the teenager behind the counter goes, you do that every time. And you get the sense of, oh, okay, we're going to see old school Christopher Reeve Clark here. But the charm of it is definitely there. And the artwork by Valentin is dead on. But I think the other part of the charm is, you're right, that Clark talks down this teenage first time offender who barely knows how a pistol works, but he talks him down in a way that I think if it had been Pa Kent standing there, Pa would have said those exact same words in that exact same way. It was not because he was invulnerable that he said those things.
Yep.
He went over to the door and he said, well, tell you what, before we start, let me lock this front door so nobody else comes in, nobody else gets hurt. And he mentions a lady who probably is elderly. He's like, we wouldn't want her to have a heart attack. And then he says, okay, and basically creates a safe space to talk to this kid. and then asks him about his life, like, what brought you to this moment, because this doesn't have to be your life is over, but tell me, what 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 are you thinking, kid? And you don't know if he's telling the truth or not, but he tricks the kid into saying that, like, the safety's on, you're not even going to be able
Sure.
to use this gun, so just hand it to me. um, but I also think that part of Clark's approach there is because there's an innocent teenage girl who it's her first time that she's been trusted to run the counter here. And you don't want anything going wrong. The kid accidentally gets stressed out and something escalates and somebody is hurt. So you see Clark perform the de-escalation, but with his I got the sense almost like if it had been a spooked animal on the farm, that he would have handled this in a similar way of, you come up to it gently, you soothe it. This is how you treat something that is spooked. And for all those reasons, I thought the writer, who in this case is G. Willow Wilson, really had a handle on the character. And at the end, there's a sweet moment where Clark thinks, okay, I got out of this. I didn't have to blow my secret identity, because he could have shot me, and then I would have had that, Richard Donner deleted scene with Lois. Then what do I do? So he is walking down the street, and the girl sees some little, I don't know if they're stuffed Superman dolls, but they're on the counter available for sale. And she grabs one and runs out to the street, and she says, wait, wait. And you see Clark go, ugh, almost Otis like, because he thinks, oh no, like, did I blow my identity somehow? And she just wants to come up and give him this gift as a thank you. And she says, you may not be Superman, but you're my Superman. And that's how the story ends. And your sort of emotional um, tank refilling of the result of that story is Clark needs these moments as Clark, because he gets them, probably, like, he's not in it, he's not into being Superman for any of the attention, but as Clark, when he's out there and he just wants to make a difference, like, these moments are good for him too, when a girl says, I know you're not the Superman, but you're my Superman, Clark.
Yeah, no, for sure. I agree with that. And also, it's a different, because I really was struck by the fact that he let the guy go. And it's funny where
Mm-hmm.
he's like, you'll keep this promise that, you won't come back here. If not, I'll know. It's like, this guy's probably like, well, all right. But it is a different effect when it's Clark Kent having this conversation with someone. And it's funny. I wouldn't say it necessarily resonates more with the would-be robber, but I think it resonates differently. And I think there's not that Superman is Batman, but there's kind of an aspect of fear or intimidation that might be at play if Superman is telling him, "Don't ever come back here," as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
Clark. Like, Clark really got through to him on a very human level. And I agree. And going back to what I was saying before, it's like, yeah, I don't really have any doubt that he would do this same thing even if he had no powers. And we talked recently, and we'll talk again, about the diner scene from Superman and Lois season 3. And same type of thing there. I've said it already. I'm going to say it now, and I'll say it again when we do our episode on that. But there's no doubt in my mind that Clark would have done exactly the same even if he had no powers. And even the way he went up to Candace's father in that scene and approached him felt very much to me like something he would have seen Pa Kent do if
Yes.
someone was out of line, right? And
Yes.
it's just that core that's just a part of his character, and you just see that on display here. That was great.
Oh yeah. I mean, even when Clark left the house, and Lois said, this isn't a job for Superman, and Clark goes, Superman's not going. you know, this is my son's father that's going.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, that was really tremendous. And I guess maybe just for a moment, circling back to Smallville, I know I had mentioned this before, but the special, the episode with the episode, the story with the waitress from the diner in Smallville,
Yeah.
written by Tom King, and just man, this one was a standout to me too. This waitress who we see waiting on the Kent family again across decades, we see her on her first day as she's a young woman, and she's dropped a pot of coffee or whatever it is, and she's cleaning it up, and she's cursing, and she's all out of
Mhm.
sorts. And of course the Kents are there with baby Clark, and everybody's kind of having they're all acclimating to their various circumstances. And then you see her. It's we see various scenes play out over the years at this diner in Smallville, whether it's Clark telling Lana that he's going to leave to go to go see the world, and she's upset, or then later down the line when he brings Lois there and she's nervous about meeting Mom and Pa,
Mhm.
when Lois and Clark ultimately bring little John there, and when Clark is there after Pa has passed. And so this woman here has seen them through all of these various stages, and it's really this beautiful exchange between her and Clark at the end of this vignette where she talks about being one of those people whose lives are in black and white, right, and not the color that's out there in the world that Clark has probably seen. And not unlike Pa Kent himself, which the waitress specifically mentions, Clark is able to say exactly the right thing about, for whatever it's worth. It's like he has seen everything, and
Mhm.
more than she could ever imagine. But he's seen everything, and for him, this woman is one of the people that represents home to him, right? And he goes,
Mhm.
and she's part of she's a fixture at this place, and that means something to him for whatever that's worth to her, and clearly it's worth a lot. But I just thought it was such a sweet story about this person who, again, typically in any of these stories would just kind of be in the background, but to kind of frame a story around this background character who's there for so much, I just thought was a wonderful take. So yeah, that was a Tom King story. I really like that one.
Yeah, and I'm sure, I'm absolutely positive that you were like me when, this was in issue 6. We had to wait the whole series for the Tom King story. And in issue 5 they say, coming up, here's the creative teams that are going to be in issue 6, and you see Tom King's name and you go, "Oh, I can only imagine." So you have these expectations, and then you read it, and you just want to do the Wayne's World, you know, the I am not worthy, because wow, did Tom nail it with this. You see the title, it's called The Special, and you're not sure, necessarily what that means, because I think we're all trained by the Lego movie to hear The Special. Um, but the special is that Pa Kent would come in and order the same thing from this diner. And this waitress, Annie, had had that rapport with him from before they probably found Clark in the field. And so Clark grew up as a little boy. Annie comes over, Pa orders the special. As a young man, Annie comes up, asks how our lives are. She really does care. Pa orders the special. And then you get to this panel, and there's a different take on Pa Kent's death, where he's in the cornfield, and it's Superman that's kneeling down and covering Pa with his cape. And that was one of those times, I will tell you, that I started crying, because that had a whole other emotional impact, because you do not know what led up to that moment. But the one thing that you can feel is whatever Clark was feeling, he was in costume and he was too late. Now, just think about that. This was not the Donner film where he and Paul were just talking and then it just happened, and it would have happened to Paul anyway. And the guilt that the teenage Clark felt in the Donner movie of, all these powers and I still couldn't save him. This is a grown Superman in costume with full power. And whatever happened, he was too late. And you just look at this panel and you think, I thought I was done crying about the death of Paul Kent, but I am not. I don't like, and it's a rare person that can bring that out again. But I sat there going, I need a minute. I need a minute on this. And so I thought, and I'm the reader. Imagine being Clark. So the next scene is Clark's at the diner without Paul for the first time. And like, think about this, for the first time in his entire life, he has walked up that sidewalk, put his hand on that door, opened the door, walked to whatever was their favorite booth, and sat down without Paul. And an angel appears in the form of a waitress named Annie. And Clark's hair is disheveled, his eyes are sunken, he is not the same Clark. And she expresses her condolences and she tells him what a good man she always thought that he was. And she asks, is there anything I can get you? And Clark starts to order what he feels like. And then he says, you know what? No, wait, I'm going to get the special. And he orders, pause, the special. And I lost it. I did, Anthony. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was crying. I lost it.
No, I don't blame you. It really packs up. And again, they get us a couple of times in this miniseries with
Same story.
Pa,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
But I think this story is yet another example of, again, I think if there's one theme that you really unites this miniseries, it's I mean, at the most basic level, people being there for each other. It's
Yeah.
Superman saves all of these people, but you see all of these instances of other people saving him, inspiring him, right? Like I think this angel, Annie the waitress. I think that's a great way to put it. And she's there at a very critical moment. She's been there all along, and then in this particular moment, really is able to step up in a way. It's funny because it's like she's just helping a neighbor, a friend, right?
Mhm.
Not realizing the larger implication, like she's helping the world's greatest hero, on top of all of that.
Right.
And then again, other stories too in this miniseries where, I mentioned before the one with Doctor, was it Charlie Mills, the one who
Hmm.
Superman has saved all of these times. And again, I just love this idea. Statistically, as unlikely as it might as it might be, but the fact that they've continued to have all these encounters, and also too along those lines, this is kind of a general point about some of these vignettes. I liked how a number of these stories really played into the idea that Superman's been around for a long time, right? Like obviously in the real world and the culture, we've 85 years, but even in the context of these stories, there are a couple of them where you see someone first encounter Superman as a child, and
Hmm.
now they're grown, right? So you
Hmm.
really feel the passage of time and Superman's long tenure in the world
Hmm.
of these stories. So I thought that was a nice touch. But with Charlie, the fact that they've continued to have these encounters and have actually struck up a bit of a friendship. But then this doctor, is actually able to help him
Hmm.
when he's shot with, what was it, probably a kryptonite bullet of some sort,
Yeah.
right? And is able to help him and kind of repay that favor. And then there's yet another altercation during the interview at GBS, and they encounter each other again. But again, and then even I think probably even more so than that, the story of the young boy who carries Superman, an unconscious Superman, up 15 flights of stairs when others who were helping had abandoned them, and somehow is able to marshal the strength to get this guy up there. And he came from another country and sort of identified with coming being this alien coming from another place, and didn't want to lose this world, right?
Hmm.
He had lost his home, and now he didn't want to lose this one. And the strength, right? The strength of will, the strength of spirit, of body that he's able to demonstrate. You just see in all these stories how this, to borrow a phrase that you just said, like fills up the tank for Superman, right? It goes both ways. Like that's the thing. It's not just that, oh, he's always saving people, right? He still would, but it's the fact that there are these instances where these people are returning the favor, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah. What you were saying earlier was exactly true. That it may not have been intentional, but there are some thematic threads here. And I made a note that the one that stood out to me the most was the theme of humans step up, whether it's because they were inspired to or because they would have anyway. Superman notwithstanding, they were just a good person. And you get this kid who, Metropolis is under attack by basically what looks like almost a Galactus figure, and in Reed Richards fashion, if Superman doesn't take the device up and deal with this, you know, so two things have to happen. It has to be Superman can't die, and also he has to take this device up. And the kid knows enough about Superman that if he can get Superman into the sun, that everyone has a shot. And so you've got this not very big kid dragging Superman up the stairs of a building that's in like danger of collapsing. And the art, by the way, is amazing on this. This is one of those that really took advantage of the colors, the limited color of the reds, showing more danger of the collapsing building. But the the true payoff of this story is that resolved itself. The kid got him into the sun. He beat the villain. Superman went back to check on the kid, and the kid was gone. And Superman, assumed slash hoped that a rescue crew found him and that he was okay. But he never knew what happened to this kid who saved his life until one day Clark is at the Daily Planet, and this is actually the first panel of the opening of the story, and he sees a now grown version of this kid. And the first thing that you see Clark thinking to himself is, "There's my hero." He looks
Yeah.
at this kid and thinks, "There's my hero." So of course, as the reader, we're hooked. Like, okay, tell us what's the story here. But after the flashback, the the kid is there to interview for a job as a photojournalist with the Daily Planet. And so Clark is almost a little bit nervous, like, I don't know when to come up to this kid. How much does he. Um, and so he does his best as just Clark Kent, not Superman, to introduce himself. And um, he's been keeping track of this kid's life and accomplishments on and off. So he knows that he pursued this photojournalistic career to do good in the world, and he knows the places that he's visited and the times that his photos have made a difference. And so he comes up to the kid and basically offers, "Hey, let me put in a word for you here." And the kid, the grown version of the kid, is very polite, but says, "It's not necessary. I got the job." And so that's another instance where not everybody needs to be saved by Superman all the time, every time. Like, this was a kid who, had he not saved Superman that day, would have still continued on to be a very productive member of society. Now, maybe that rescue of Superman spurred him even more to do more, and maybe in a slightly different way. But um, even though he lost his arm in that rescue by some falling brick, but fear not, Star Labs literally in the story did give him another arm. Um, but he did fine. He did fine because Jor-El was right and Paul was right. There's a strength in humanity. There's a strength in people. There's a scene in the Robert Venditti written story where Paul is telling Clark, most people want to be good people, and this kid is an example of that. And so in the end, where you see him use the replacement arm that he gave up to save Superman one day, which there's a joke in the story that the kid doesn't even put it on his resume, even though he doesn't. And he shakes hands with Clark, and Clark says, "That's quite a grip you've got there." And I just love that it's very rare, I think, for Clark to meet somebody and feel that their heroism matches his. And you felt that here. Not just because it started with him saying, "There's my hero," but just the kid proved it. Not just that day, but the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, with what he achieved on his own. So it was wonderful to see Clark be able to have that footing that you normally imagine only Lois gives him, of an equal in the bravery that you're willing to exhibit. You know, I mean, what a way to kick it off. It was better than the some of the scary ones, like when Clark went to the prison camp.
Yeah, we got to talk about that. I just real quick. So, you mentioned again the use of the color, and I just want to
Yeah,
say, like, it's funny because that's, I guess, at the outset or at the most superficial level, the hook of this, right? That it's only utilizing the red and blue, and obviously it's far deeper than that when you actually read these stories. But there are a couple, and like one that comes to mind is the Lex story where he's trying to get the drop on Superman using red kryptonite. So, right, that was a story that lent itself very nicely to the use of that color palette. Then there was another one. Was it Mixie or another imp who had stolen all the color from the world? Was it Mixie
a
Spirit?
different imp,
A different
a
imp. Okay.
different one. Yeah,
But then eventually gives so they're in this black and white world and they don't really remember what it used to look like, but they know something's missing. And then the imp gives Superman this box of crayons, essentially like the color to release back into the world. And it's this debate because as he's releasing these colors and all of the emotions that come along with it, it will change things, and possibly for the better, possibly for the worse. And of course, he releases Red, and it's passion and courage, but also anger and violence and blood. And then Blue. So we start with Red and Blue, and go from there. But so like there were some stories that like really made very specific use of the color palette here. So I just wanted to mention that. But yeah, the opening story written by John Ridley, which actually there's an editor's note about World's Finest numbers 192 and 193. Have you read those issues?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. Had you read them previously, or you read them because of this?
Because of this.
Okay. So I have not read them. I looked them up. But yeah, I mean this vignette, the opening story, which was, it kind of like knocked me back, and I was like, oh my god, like what is this gonna be like? Because this was very heavy. But it's well, actually, let me ask you first the original story. I mean, what I don't know, anything that you can share about that. I would be so curious. That World's Finest two-parter. I mean, did it track, I guess, big picture with what's sort of recount? I'm assuming this is a far more harrowing version of what transpired in the original World's Finest issue, right?
It tracks 1-to-1 with some details left out, but in World's Finest 192 and 193, which came out in 1970, illustrated by Ross Andrew, who was one of my favorite Superman artists, and written by Bob Haney. The story was called "The Prison of No Escape." So I have to believe that in 1970, with the Vietnam era, and some of the messages were woven in here, to bring to light certain things. And the premise is that there's this fictional country called Lubania, and that has a dictator, sort of a Russian philosophy type of dictator, at least of the 1970s. And he had figured out a way to make artificial kryptonite waves. And so basically that was his spider web. He was going to be able to catch Superman and keep him depowered enough that he could keep him in this prison camp. And the dictator was Colonel Kozlov. And the conceit of this is that he was somehow able to keep Superman in his camp for 8 months. And that was true in the original 2 comics.
That was probably my biggest question, because I assumed that it wouldn't
Yes.
have been for that long, but it was. Jeez.
It was. And not only that, but they did the whole propaganda thing where he was telling the world, I have your weapon of imperialism, your Western blah, blah, blah cannot blah, blah, blah. And so he was using Superman in this way. But that was always something that I really wondered, like, okay, the Justice League exists. There is no way that in 8 months he would not have been rescued. But it's the conceit of the story, so you go with it. And eventually, Batman decides he's going to go rescue him. And Kozlov is smart enough to know, well, this is probably going to happen. So he dressed up some guys in fake Batman suits, and he kept tricking Superman into thinking, this one's Batman, he's going to come rescue. And they never were the real Batman. One day the real Batman shows up and he doesn't believe him, and they end up fighting until he so it was kind of almost a cute, misunderstanding, typical thing. But it's actually Perry White that ends up rescuing him.
Ah, nice.
Because Perry has been fighting the media battle in America. You're going to come at us with propaganda, or we're going to fight it with the journalism here in America. And so he goes over and he rescues both Batman and Superman, who have been captured. Only Kozlov dresses up 2 guys in Batman and Superman suits. So Perry takes home the wrong guys, and they have a bomb, and they're going to blow up, Metropolis. No, actually, I take that back. They're going to kill the president.
Oh,
yeah. So high stakes. So finally, Batman, being the strategist that he is, he figures out this ray is depowering Superman. So Superman and Batman switch costumes and switch cells. And now the ray is focused on Batman, who cares? And Superman is able to regain his strength. And one day, when he's strong enough, they simply fly out of there and escape, and then come back later and arrest everyone and so on. So that is actually crucial to understanding this new continuation of the story, because when you hear in this new story Clark Kent talking about the trauma and how his hand is shaking, and it doesn't shake when he goes up against Darkseid, but it is shaking because he has chosen to come and stand in front of Colonel Kozlov again in a journalistic capacity. You can't truly appreciate that if you hadn't understood everything that had happened.
I no, I don't dispute that. But it's still really packed a punch, and I gotta say, man, like that's a deep cut. I mean, my pre-crisis reading is still fairly limited. I've made a decent dent, but it's really ultimately still a small fraction of what's out there. But I was not familiar with this story, and that's what this miniseries leads off with. And right on the first page, you get that editor's note
Mm-hmm.
about the two issues, and I yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk about the original story, because I didn't think the story, that original one, went as far as it did, and so that's fascinating. Because yeah, as you're reading this, again, it's this very harrowing, and I was really shocked at the 8 month long period where Superman had been this prisoner of war. And so, like you said, I mean, the setup of this is Clark in the present day going to Lubania, which now in the post Cold War era has become this economic powerhouse, and Kozlov is this like financial leader, and Clark's going to interview him. And as he's going there, it's bringing up all of these memories, of course, and he talks about essentially kind of the hubris of inserting himself in a rescue operation in Lubania, right? Kind of disregarding the politics and borders and everything that was going
Mm-hmm.
on at the time. And again, like you said, they end up getting the drop on him with the synthetic kryptonite. And again, the fact that he was in prison for 8 months, it was just, you feel for the character. And again, it gets real dark. I mean, as Clark is recounting this, he's like, they did things to me, and while Kozlov watched, and just, and again, even like you said, like the propaganda piece of this, that they're kind of parading Superman out there, or via photos at least, and kind of showing how this symbol of American dominance has been taken down and imprisoned, and it's just to see Superman degraded in that
Mm-hmm.
way was honestly, like, it was really tough. It was tough to stomach. This really inspired. I'm going to track down those two World's Finest issues, because I would really like to read them. Just kind of a fascinating, unexplored pocket, for me, that I would like to read more, because this was a strong one.
Yeah, and the fact that some stories deal with the truth aspect, like the kid coming out, and some stories deal with the justice aspect, like this one. And to know the level of torture is not too strong of a word that was done to Clark, and in the original to Bruce also. Um, the level of inhumanity and cruelty that was exhibited by this guy who is now rich and was let off the hook, that I think it rocked Clark's sense of justice. And that was one of those unspoken things in this story that still vibrates, and you don't know why, but it does. You just don't like it. There's just something about this you really don't like. And I loved that there is a panel where Clark acknowledges the rage that he has,
Yeah, he
and
imagines just
he
frying this guy with his heat vision.
hmm in fact, he admits to himself that there's a part of him that is hoping that Kozlov will say something bad enough that will justify him heat visioning the guy off the face of the earth. But then he knows, I don't really hope that. And then you don't know, you don't know where this story is going, and it goes the way of Kozlov basically says, um, like many villains do, you naive idiot, grow up.
Yeah, that piece was interesting, right? Because I think, for as Clark articulates, I guess he's expecting, or at least would be able to wrestle with either a level of remorse from Kozlov, or if he were totally unrepentant, and that's kind of what triggers that, like, heat vision, fantasy. But what you get is from Kozlov is kind of somewhere in between, where it's like he acknowledges it, and he's like, well, we all did bad things at that time, right? But it's not really taking ownership, or asking forgiveness or anything to that extent. So it's like somewhere kind of in the middle, and it's one of those things where again, for Clark, for all of the times he's thought about something like this, um, this is kind of maybe somewhat down the middle, that it doesn't know what to do with it, I suppose. Whereas the other two responses, maybe it would be easier to sort of take in.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, Kozlov didn't say, "You naive idiot, grow up," but it's the lesson Clark had to learn of, this is how things go, and not just sometimes, but often. And I think, he didn't know in this story what to do with it. But then as he's leaving, there's some sort of police security vehicle that goes by him and with a siren on. And right as he's thinking, you know, does anybody care about justice? Does anybody care about any of this? And he sees that, and he just takes a beat and stops and says, I care. And the last thing you see is he's in this other country. He has no legal right to act, but he's just seen evidence that there's someone who needs help. And in the midst of all of his doubt, there's one thing that he is sure of, which is, I care. And so you see him start to do the shirt rip, and we end with, no matter what the consequences, I will always care.
Yeah. It's funny because there are so many, sort of traumatic, to put it mildly, experiences that the character has been through over all of these years. Uh, just as a quick example, because I always think about this one, early on in the Joe Kelly run on Action Comics, where he and Wonder Woman spent 1,000 years in Valhalla fighting this never-ending war, and of course he eventually makes it back. But like the idea that he could have experienced that length of time under those circumstances, separated from Lois and everyone else, it's kind of staggering to think of just kind of settling back into his normal life. But I don't. It's not like I equate that with the character and the trauma that he's overcome. It's not top of mind generally as I'm reading these stories, and that's why I think I was so struck by this, because it's 8 months, it's not 1,000 years, but there's this ugliness and realism to that. I guess that's the thing that's different, right? Like the Valhalla situation is kind of in this otherworldly supernatural realm, whereas this is something that happens, and it just so happened it occurred to Superman. So this idea that they could get the drop on him and he could be powerless and imprisoned. And yeah, I mean, yes, of course, it begs the question, why didn't the Justice League come? But maybe, whereas Superman disregarded those borders initially, maybe the Justice League, for whatever reason, political pressure or whatever the case may be, didn't or couldn't take that step. And it's scary, right? Like this idea that, what is he going to do? Can he get out? But again, I think it's just that realism and that human ugliness to it that, like, I guess what I'm trying to get to is I never thought of this character as carrying this with him, because I never knew that the story existed. But as I'm reading this, It's like, wow, yeah, I mean, that would, and I know that's a pre-crisis story and all of that, but it's like, yeah, I mean, if that is part of the character's history, it's like that would change the way I would look at the character, like that he's carrying this with him.
Yeah. And, especially in those, Golden Age and Silver Age stories, I grew up mostly reading the Silver Age, and he had all these powers. Like, it was super everything. He had, super hypnotism. He had super this, super that. There's a story here in the Red and Blue series where some school kids and their school teacher are at the fortress because he's invited them there. And it starts off by setting up, the forbidden room with the huge lock on it, the one part in the fortress that this door stays locked all the time. No one goes in there, and it doesn't tell you what treasure is in there, but it is beyond valuable to Superman, and that's all you know. But the story opens with him remembering the farewell of Jor-El and Lara as an infant, and him looking up from the still open starship at their faces and listening to them talk. And in this version, Jor-El mentions that he thought that they still had 4 more years before Krypton's destruction. And that hit me reading it.
Yep.
because Jarrell saw, he said, I thought we would have time to watch our son grow up at least a little. And I thought, wow. I mean, these stories continue to find a way to make this loss even more tragic. It's it's not Marlon Brando who said, we have 30 days or less. This was Jor-El thought they had 4 years, and that's been ripped away from him now. But my point, which is, referring to your point, of the trauma, is that Clark is remembering this, and I as a reader, I thought, does he have super memory? Is this one of those like carryover silver age things? Like, is this truly traumatic for him because he's remembering word for word that Jor-El said he thought they had 4 years? He's not looking into the Phantom Zone. He's not looking into some time portal. He's standing in his fortress, just remembering. And we've never seen that part of him before. That he has that capacity to carry this around like a movie that he can't stop watching. And for the first time, I thought, this is what Bruce goes through. This movie that just keeps playing and playing and playing of the time he lost his parents. And that's really one of the first times that I've ever been able to see that and make that connection of, if this is true, he does have empathy for Bruce.
I hope it's not true. Like, I agree with everything you're saying, but yeah, it's like I wouldn't want that for the character, right?
Mm-mm.
To have to continually relive that. It's heartbreaking, to consider that to be the case. A moment ago, I was just looking down. I was still listening to you, but I was just looking at the list of stories as we're getting deep into the recording here. I know we're not going to hit every single one or unpack everyone as thoroughly as I think we have been with these, but just to hit on a couple of things. Uh, it's funny. Very, very recently, we covered Stephen T. Siegel, his "It's a Bird" original graphic novel, and then his run on
Mm-hmm.
the Superman title. And he has a story in here called "Own," where Martha's having lunch with the ladies at the diner, and they make a remark about how she and Johnny, which she corrects them at the end of the story, they have this child, even though it's not their own, right? Their own child, and she has this. She launches into this whole thing about all the ways in which he is theirs in every way, right? In terms of how she cares for him and worries for him, and it was good. I have to say. I mean, I know we were a little hard on Stephen T. Siegel and his run on the Superman book, but I thought this was a nice vignette and a nice spotlight for Martha. Because again, I know we've been talking a lot and the stories that have had Jonathan and Martha, but definitely we've been. A lot of these vignettes skew more towards the Pa of it all. So I thought this was a nice one, a nice showcase for Martha. You know, what
Yeah,
other?
it really
Yeah,
was, and it was nice to see. It was nice to see the Martha that you don't mess with. That she was not rude, but she, as they would say, said her piece.
yes,
And um, when you get to see that Martha, it reminded me. I think it was in somewhere in For All Seasons, um, or maybe it was in one of the reboots with the Gary Frank art. But there's a scene where Jonathan has somehow perturbed Martha, and they were about to have pie, and she tells him something like, "You can get your own pie, Jonathan can't," and just leaves the room. And Jonathan just sort of looks at Clark and just shrugs like, you know. And it's nice to see that Clark grew up with two strong parents
yes,
that knew that there is a time to say something, and when that time comes, you say your piece, you do what's right. And that he got that from Martha too. I loved this story because we got to see that. And for half a second, the art, I thought, is this lost Tim Sale art? Because the style had so much of Tim Sale, and as you know, he's my favorite Superman artist of all time. So I love this one on many levels.
I know, especially when Clark, who shows up and he's visiting Smallville and he's visiting Martha, and he shows up and he walks in. It really had that For All Seasons vibe to it. It was Duncan Rolu. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that
Mhm.
correctly, but yeah, that was it. I love the art in that as well. I got to give a quick shout out in the story with Kilgore and the Manhunters.
Mhm.
Fellow podcaster Michael Bailey and his wife are drawn into into the story. They're the two who are rescued, and I've seen it might even be his avatar on Twitter, or it was at some point, but like I've seen that image of him drawn as a comic book character a bunch. But just like that other panel we mentioned, like I never had the context for it, so it was so cool, and I had forgotten, that this was where it was popping up. So as I was reading, I was like, there he is. So that was a nice touch.
Oh, that's great. I love Michael. I love his guest shots on Superman Movie Minute too. He's always wonderful.
Yeah, no, very nice. Yeah. No, it's been great. We've podcasted together a number of times now, and it's great. He'll actually be on, doing the quick math here, he'll be on the next episode of another exciting episode in the Adventures of Superman, the George Reeves rewatch podcast that I'm doing. We talked about the Evil 3. We already recorded that, and that'll be coming out soon. It was a lot of fun, and that's a real standout season 1 episode from Adventures of Superman. So for anyone who's curious, and if you haven't sampled that podcast yet, or if you haven't been keeping up with it, that's a really good one to jump back in with. We had a lot of fun. So what other vignettes that we haven't talked about do you want to at least hit on before we wrap up? And again, just to say for the audience, if we haven't talked about your favorite one here, I'm sorry. There are a lot. I mean, it's quite a few vignettes. I know we've covered a fair amount. I know we haven't hit every single one. So if this ends and we haven't hit one that you really like, maybe we'll do a follow up at some point. But I guess, in having this conversation, I was curious, and I'm glad we didn't have as much of an agenda. Like, I was curious which of the ones would come to mind, the most, like which ones resonated with us. And I think that's kind of guided our conversation. I've liked that a lot. But yeah, what other ones do you want to talk about?
The Robert Venditti story, because he was another one like Tom King and Matt Wagner. When I saw, their story's coming up, I can't wait. And I'm a little biased because he's a friend, but when his story came on in the order, and I got to that page and I flipped to it, and I realized that it was starting out, and here's Clark, and he's in Metropolis, and I'm like, okay, this is great, this will be fine. And I turned the page, and it's Smallville, and Clark's young, and there's Pa, and I went, yes, Robert wrote a Pa Kent story. And the thing that I love about Robert's story is the same thing that I loved about the Jonathan Kent from Smallville, and some of these other times where you see the relationship where Jonathan and Clark are out running an errand, and it's just the two of them. They're not doing chores, they're not doing, they're out, and it's father and son time. And in this case, they're delivering some supplies to another family in Smallville that has come on hard times because the wife is ill. And Clark starts out innocently enough asking, can we spare the food and the hay and the things that we're giving him? And Jonathan basically tells him that, when somebody needs you, you find it. You find what you can spare. And there's no small thing to give. And that really resonated with me too, because when we talk about some of my visiting children and such, and the time that you spend with them, there is no gesture that is small to someone who is in need. There is no, nothing is insignificant. Nothing is small to someone who needs it. And so I loved that was the message here. And so Clark, to his credit, quickly understands the lesson of, okay, Paul, you're right. And then he immediately switches tact and says, well, have we brought enough? And you have to love that aspect of, if this is what Clark's upbringing was like, moment after moment after moment of this, I believe it. I completely buy into the man that Clark became. And Clark was even kind of questioning it when Jonathan says, other families are bringing things too. It's not just ours, but our small thing and everyone else's small thing adds up to enough. And Clark says, well, even so-and-so, because I thought he and this guy were fighting. And Jonathan just laughs like, yeah, yeah, that blew up. But in moments like these, that doesn't matter. And you then flip and you see how Clark is grown as Superman in Metropolis. And in this particular instance, there's something we assume really huge and heavy that he's holding up. He's just hovering in the air, holding it up and giving the rescue crews enough time to come and get the kids. And it's not that it has a direct relationship with this memory of Pa, but it almost makes you feel like it just has given him time to think. and this is the thing that he's thinking about. But that idea that there's no small act, this story unintentionally tied right into the other story where Martha said it's not enough to be bothered by something, you have to decide what can you do about it. And thematically, I just really loved how some of these understandings of the character were realm consistent. And every time I encountered that, I thought, "Good for you, Robert. Good for you, everybody who gets it."
Yeah, look, I mean, my love of Smallville, not just the TV series, but the setting, that time period, the upbringing with the Kents. I'm always there for that. And I always love when you get to actually see and hear those lessons, those pearls of wisdom from Jonathan and or Martha that inform the character and account for why. Look, this it's the fundamental question: who would not abuse this power? Who would use this power just to help the way that he does? And when you know the Kents and you know Clark, the person who was raised by Jonathan and Martha, that's the answer, and it all clicks into place. But again, it's the whole show and don't tell. And so when you actually get to see moments like that, and it calls to mind that the famous line, the from the Marlon Brando's Jor-El of, they're great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. And you see that echoed here in what Jor-El and what Jonathan is saying of like people fundamentally they're good, they want to be good. And Clark has the opportunity to be this example and to be this good neighbor. I think this idea of being neighborly. And I remember there's, a Christopher Reeve interview where he was talking about how he sees the character. And a lot of it was kind of grounded in that idea of being a good neighbor. And Superman's here to help and he's just able to do more, right? But again, you see those values nurtured in these lessons on the farm. So it's great. And again, once again, tying in with people helping people. So yeah, that was a strong one as well. There's also, we're mentioning some creators here. Mark Waid has a story. It's cool because
Yes.
obviously now, as we're in 2023, Mark Waid has had this massive resurgence at DC Comics, and he's got his own little corner now with World's Finest and Teen Titans and Shazam and all kinds of stuff. But this was a little bit earlier on as he was kind of getting back into the swing of things at DC, and he's got a very fun. That's the thing too. I know we're talking about these very emotionally resonant tear-inducing stories. There's some fun stuff in there too, and I think Wade's is a really fun one where Superman goes to the fifth dimension to plague Mxyzptlk for a little while and give a little bit of a taste of his own medicine, but nevertheless ultimately ends up helping Mixie to Mixie's chagrin. Because I guess the custom there is when you're courting someone, you prank them, and so Mixie tries to prank this other imp with a snake in a can sort of thing, but it ends up being just ordinary peanut brittle, and he realizes that someone switched it out on him, and it was Superman. But Superman ultimately ends up explaining this and spinning it to this other imp and making it. Turning it around and saying, "Oh, the ultimate prank was that he wasn't pranking you," and she's all into that. And so,
Right.
this drives Mixie nuts because the one saving grace of being plagued by Superman was this idea that, well, he was kind of a jerk and he did this, but it's like, no, he ultimately still helped him. So I thought that was a lot of fun, and also the fact that in saying his name backwards to return to our dimension, it's not Superman backwards that he has to say; it's Clark Kent. So that was a nice touch.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, yeah, that was so brilliant. In the same way that there was the story a while back where uh, there was a trick that didn't work on Batman because in his mind he was Batman, he was not Bruce Wayne,
Yep.
and so that mental trick worked on everybody else except for him. So the fact that Superman, his real name can't be said backwards because Bixie won't say Clark Kent, was great. You had to have had the same sort of Bruce Timm animated vibe from this story that I did, right?
Yes.
You heard the voices too, right?
Of course. Of course.
Yeah. Not just Gilbert Gottfried, but Sandra Bernhardt. I was hearing both of them, as this went on, and yeah, that was a joy. Like Mark really knew how to play. Like it could have been an episode of the Bruce Timm animated series, and it would have stacked up there with Mixel which was the other one.
Yes, for sure. Then, Mixie makes another appearance here in a far more cold-hearted turn in the Bizarro story for the man who has nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
What was your take on that one?
Um, well, I won't tease you about Bizarro being your favorite. um, at least they didn't do too much backwards Bizarro talk in this.
No.
I didn't know where the story was going at first because it seemed like just a space rescue mission for a Mars rover until you realize that. Wait,
Oh, that's the
we're talking about two different ones.
so the Francis Manipul one. That's the one on Mars. But no, I was referring to the one where it's Bizarro's birthday, and he's seemingly
Right.
being celebrated by the Justice League and showered with presents, and then they end up all taunting him, and he feels awful, and it ends up being this ruse set up by Mixus. And then
Yeah,
Superman
yeah,
actually
yeah. You're
shows up
exactly right.
with a true birthday present, and they have a nice moment.
Right. Yeah. It was very like very Charlie Brown, heartwarming. You imagine Charlie Brown throws a party and absolutely nobody comes, um, and at the end, one person actually does come. Only with this twist of in that interim where nobody cared about your birthday, you actually had someone give you these hallucinatory nightmares of you thought that you had a full party of people who loved you, but they were only there to laugh at you and they were only there to tell you that you were worthless. And so you go from that low to the high of actually you do have a friend and he did come all on his own and he brought a gift and he does care about you. That was pretty great.
Yeah, that was a nice touch. I liked that a lot. I did not get as much mileage out of that the Mars story with Bizarro. I'll be honest, I had to read it a few times to even really completely get what was going on there. I guess the gist of it was that Bizarro was on Mars, and there was also blue kryptonite that was allowing him to think clearly, but he was trapped under it and it was killing him. And then Superman moves the blue kryptonite and he's saved, but he's back to the backwards thinking. Was that the gist of it, or I still might not have understood it?
That was basically the gist. I mean, it was sort of a straightforward rescue. There weren't too many layers. The the other one psychologically had many more layers because you really do see that Superman wishes nothing but the best for Bizarro, and even in this small way, like just celebrating Bizarro's birthday just to show him that he's not alone. You can think, well, at the surface layer, Superman just does that because he's Superman, and but then you peel back a few and you realize that Superman very much knows what it feels like. Those days he thought he was the only one like him in the universe. He has not forgotten that. And so, everything else aside, all of the history of all the times Bizarro's been confused or Bizarro's accidentally caused a lot of problems, still Superman knows on this day, I want to make sure he doesn't feel alone because I remember. So, the best Bizarro stories are the ones that are also Superman stories, and this is one of those.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, as much as I know, we joke about it, I don't not the biggest Bizarro fan in the world. It's mostly though the backwards speak that gets me. Once you take that out of the equation, I'm usually more on board. And there are some Bizarro stories. Again, we talked about the Superman the animated series, and I love that take on the character. And so it's not that I dislike any Bizarro story. And I thought the one with Mixus here was particularly effective. So, is there
Yeah.
anything else, any last vignette that you're dying to talk about that we that we didn't get to?
Oh, we hit the majors, and I made it through without choking up. But I will say one of the things that I loved about the series was all the outstanding cover art, the
Yeah.
variations, and I mean, because we got Doc Shaner, I mean, we got some heavy hitters that contributed to this series. I mean, it's just worth it on every level.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you again, I wish I had actually cracked these open a lot sooner. I mean, thankfully, it only came out a couple of years ago, so I don't feel like I've been sitting on this for too long. But
Hmm.
what an absolute delight to read these, and especially to talk about them with you. And I appreciate all of the passion that you brought to this, and it was great to have this conversation. And once again, if anyone hasn't read these, please do. And I just, I've not heard about any plans for any kind of follow up. I hope we get some sort of additional volume of this at some point because I just think it's a great. I guess that's the last thing I want to say is that I just love the idea of this. I mean, it ended up being executed beautifully, but just the
Hmm.
idea of this, and even color palette aside, I mean, again, that's a nice hook for it and everything, but just this idea of this anthology where you can bring in different creators telling these short stories that again have a different mandate and are looking at the character in a different way. I just think it's great and valuable, and I would love to see more of that. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, 100%. I would never get tired of these. And I was reflecting, on what is it about this? Because as I hope the listening audience is sort of grasping, like, remember, all of these things that we've been talking about have been in 8 pages.
Yeah.
It seems so much larger, but truly they have been told in this format. Um, and I think if I step back and I thought, why is it that I love this series so much? It's because the phrase, like, um, integrity is what you do when no one's looking. Um,
Yep.
this is sort of a way where we get to see moments of Superman's life, of how is he when no one's looking, or growing up, how was he when no one was looking, or how it's it makes his character so much more legitimate because these little stories give us those little moments. Clark at the diner right after his father died, he didn't think anyone was around, and then Annie comes up and talks to him. So she got to see Superman when no one else was looking, and she saw how he coped with grief and how is he going to possibly channel that. And, like, one person got to see that, and we got to see the story of that one person who saw that. That is the gift that these stories are. And I hope that in concept that these things can continue to be told and continue to be given, because now that I've read them, and I'm choosing my words carefully and I'm not saying them lightly, they have become a part of me. There are life aspects that I've gotten out of these stories that I cannot imagine not having been a part of me and not having gotten, if they had never been published. Like, I can't conceive of that now. So I only hope that it can continue.
Well said. And I think I had one more thing, but I just think that like a lot of the ideas, the dynamics, the philosophies that you see presented here, it's not that you never get them anywhere else, but they're often, just again, part of a larger story, right? Whereas here, this was really the main thrust. Like, this was really about the heart of the character and these dynamics. And, again, it's great to have both kinds of stories. And I'm particularly glad that we got these where you don't typically get this kind of showcase. So yeah, I would love to see more of this, but I thank you so much for coming on here. So you are at Wearing the Cape on Instagram. Is there anywhere else you want to direct folks?
By the time this podcast is released, I'll have my newest article on the Daily Planet. So that is dailyplanetdc.com. And it's part 2 of my story of the secret Hispanic history of Superman, leading up to the new Flash movie where Sasha Calle will be playing Supergirl. She is not the first person of Hispanic heritage to have contributed mightily to the legend that we all love. And I go through all of the known and very unknown aspects and contributions over the years. So I would hope that people would go to dailyplanetdc.com and check that out.
Awesome. Fascinating. I look forward to reading the entire series, and I hope our audience will as well. So thank you, Daniel. Thank you, audience. As always, I always appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you come back in 1 week for our next all-new episode. It's about what you do. It's about action. This show is part of the Flat Squirrel Podcast Network, home to Digging for Kryptonite, another exciting episode in the adventures of Superman, Summoning the Zords, and My Comic Shop History, available wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review today. Sign up at patreon.com/Anthony Desiato for additional content. Thank you all.